What if the person you thought you knew had a life full of sacrifices you never imagined? This funeral changed everything. The crowd at Cypress Grove Cemetery stood solemnly around the freshly dug grave, their quiet murmurs carried away by a gentle breeze. A mix of family, friends, and acquaintances had gathered to pay their respects to Robert Henley, a man revered for his charitable work and warm presence in the community. The polished black headstone gleamed in the afternoon sun, etched with the words, "A life of service and sacrifice." Among the mourners, an elderly black woman stood out, though not by intention. A deep green dress flowed modestly around her, and her silver hair was tucked neatly beneath a simple hat. She clutched a single red rose, her hands steady, but her eyes betrayed a weight of emotion far heavier than those around her. While others exchanged pleasantries, few acknowledged her. She remained silent, standing at the edge of the crowd, her presence both commanding and understated. It wasn't until the pastor concluded his final prayer that she stepped forward, slowly making her way to the front. The crunch of gravel beneath her heels was the only sound as the mourners parted to let her through. When she reached the grave, she paused, looking down at the polished casket. Then, with great care, she placed the rose on top and turned to face the crowd. "My name is Hattie Delaney," she began, her voice steady and clear. "I doubt many of you know me, but I knew Robert better than anyone here." A ripple of surprise swept through the crowd. Faces turned to one another, brows furrowed, mouths whispered in curiosity. Who was this woman? How could she claim such a deep connection to the man they all thought they knew so well? Hattie's gaze swept over the sea of faces, her expression calm yet resolute. "Before today ends, you'll understand why I'm here," she said. "And you'll understand the Robert Henley most of you never knew." Her words hung in the air, thick with an unspoken promise. But what Hattie was about to share would leave everyone questioning everything they thought they knew about the man they'd come to honor. The murmurs had subsided, leaving only the rustle of leaves as Hattie drew in a deep breath. Her voice carried a calm authority, compelling everyone to listen. "I met Robert 50 years ago," she began, her gaze distant, as if the memories were playing before her. "It wasn't here, in this town. It was in Montgomery, Alabama, during a time when people like me weren't welcome in places like this." The crowd leaned in slightly, curiosity flickering in their eyes. Hattie continued, her voice tinged with both pride and pain. "Robert was just a young man then, full of fire and ambition. He worked as a teacher, but his heart was in the civil rights movement. That's where we crossed paths, on the steps of a church where we were organizing sit-ins. He wasn't afraid to stand beside me, even when it meant losing his job or facing threats." Gasps rippled through the group. The Robert they had known was generous and kind, but none had ever heard of his involvement in such struggles. Hattie let the weight of her words settle before pressing on. "We weren't just comrades in the fight for justice," she said, her voice softening. "We were friends. No, more than friends. We became each other's family when the world seemed determined to tear us apart. He was there for me when I lost my sister to the violence of those times. And I was there for him when he had to rebuild his life after being ostracized by his own." Hattie's hand trembled slightly as she adjusted her hat, her gaze fixed on the casket. "We shared meals, stories, tears. He called me his sister in every way that mattered, even when it wasn't safe for him to say it out loud." The crowd shifted uncomfortably, the gravity of her words sinking in. It was hard to reconcile this image of Robert with the man they knew, a polished philanthropist who had quietly helped many but never spoke of his own battles. "But," she said, her voice growing firmer, "what I'm telling you isn't just about the past. It's about the man he became because of those struggles." She paused, scanning the crowd, letting the silence stretch just long enough. But what Hattie shared next would go beyond their bond, pulling back the curtain on sacrifices none of them could have imagined. Hattie's hands clenched tightly around her purse, her voice unwavering as she spoke. Robert and I didn't just survive the times, we fought through them. But that fight demanded sacrifices that left marks on both of us, marks most of you would never see. She glanced at the crowd, her piercing eyes meeting theirs, as if daring anyone to look away. In 1967, Robert lost his job for attending a march in Selma. The school board called it unbecoming conduct. But we all knew what it really was: retribution. He didn't tell anyone here about it because he didn't want pity. He packed up what little he had and moved to a small one-bedroom house on the south side of Montgomery. That's where he lived, scraping by on tutoring gigs, never once abandoning the fight. Hattie's voice cracked slightly as she continued. When my own house was firebombed in retaliation for hosting meetings, it was Robert who showed up in the middle of the night with his car. He drove me and my 2 nephews to safety, without hesitation, knowing full well the risk. She turned back to the casket, her expression softening. That's who Robert was. Not the polished man in the tailored suit most of you remember, but someone who walked through fire for the people he cared about. The crowd stood in silence, captivated, as she pulled a folded piece of paper from her purse. "This," she said, holding it up, "is a letter Robert wrote to me in 1972. I want to read just one part to you." Hattie unfolded the letter with care, her hands shaking just enough to show how much it meant to her. She began to read aloud, her voice trembling but clear. "Hattie, you are the sister I chose when life gave me none. We have shared burdens no one should bear, but I would carry them again for you without question. You remind me every day that love is not about blood, it's about who shows up when the world turns its back." Her voice broke on the last line, and she paused to regain her composure. The crowd, previously so stoic, now shifted visibly, some dabbing at their eyes, others staring at the ground in shame for not knowing this side of the man they had come to honor. "Robert never turned his back on anyone," Hattie said, folding the letter again. "Not even when it cost him everything. And yet how many of you here knew any of this? How many of you cared enough to ask?" She let the question hang, the weight of her words pressing on the group like a heavy fog. But as the truth of Robert's sacrifices sank in, Hattie revealed something even more profound, an act of courage that would redefine his legacy forever. The air seemed heavier as Hattie pressed on, her words laced with both sorrow and defiance. "There's one more truth about Robert. A truth none of you would have guessed, yet it's one that shaped everything he stood for." The crowd tensed, hanging on her every word as she took a steadying breath. Robert didn't just fight for others. He fought a battle no one could see. For years, he hid the fact that he was supporting a child, a son he couldn't openly claim because of who the mother was. A collective gasp rippled through the group. Hattie's eyes swept the stunned faces, but she pressed forward without hesitation. His son, Samuel, was born to a woman Robert couldn't marry because of the time and place they lived in. The boy was black, like me, and Robert was forced to keep it quiet for fear of what it would do to his career and reputation in certain circles. The whispers grew louder now, people exchanging glances of disbelief. But Hattie wasn't finished. "I was there when Samuel was born," she said softly, "and Robert made sure that boy never went without. He paid for his schooling, wrote letters every week, and visited whenever he could under the cover of darkness. He made sure Samuel had everything he never had growing up. A father's love, even if it had to be a quiet love." Tears welled in her eyes, but her voice stayed strong. "And Samuel, the man you didn't know existed, is here today." At that, a tall man stepped forward from the back of the crowd. His presence was commanding, with broad shoulders and a quiet dignity in the way he moved. The resemblance to Robert was unmistakable. The crowd turned to stare, stunned into silence. Samuel walked up to Hattie and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "For everything." Hattie smiled at him through her tears. "It was always my honor." She turned back to the group, addressing them once more. "Robert loved all of you in his way, but his truest love was in the people he fought for. those of us who didn't have the luxury of being seen in polite society. That's why I'm here today, to make sure you know the real man behind all the accolades." The silence that followed wasn't just shock, it was reflection, a reckoning with the truth that had been hidden in plain sight. But before the mourners could fully process what they'd learned, Hattie had one final story to share. A moment of bravery that would define Robert's legacy forever. The crowd stood frozen, the weight of Hattie's words settling over them like a blanket too heavy to shake off. The murmurs that had filled the air earlier were gone, replaced by a deafening silence. All eyes were on Samuel, who stood tall and resolute beside Hattie, his presence a living testament to the secrets Robert had carried. An older man near the front of the group cleared his throat, his voice breaking the stillness. I never knew," he stammered. "Robert never said a word about any of this." Hattie's gaze softened as she looked at him. "He wasn't the kind of man to seek praise for doing what was right," she said. "But make no mistake, he carried the weight of these sacrifices every single day." A middle-aged woman, her face streaked with tears, stepped forward hesitantly. "I remember him helping my family when my father lost his job," she said quietly. "I thought I understood his kindness, but now it feels so much deeper." Hattie nodded, her voice steady yet filled with emotion. "Robert didn't just give out of convenience. He gave because he understood what it meant to go without, and he never wanted anyone to feel that same pain." The group began to stir, fragments of their own memories of Robert bubbling to the surface. Each story shared painted a picture of a man whose generosity and strength were rooted in a life few of them had truly understood. But it wasn't just the memories that hung in the air. It was the guilt. Many began to realize they had only known the polished version of Robert, the man who wore his success like a shield to protect the truth of his struggles. A young man near the back finally spoke up, his voice trembling with emotion. "It's not fair," he said, his hands clenching into fists. "He deserved to be celebrated for everything, not just the parts we wanted to see." Hattie turned to him, her expression softening. "You're right," she said. "But Robert wasn't a man who cared about credit. He cared about impact. And his greatest legacy isn't the plaques on the walls or the accolades in your programs. It's the lives he touched, yours, mine, and Samuel's." Samuel stepped forward then, his voice low but firm. "My father always told me that the measure of a person isn't what they leave behind in things. It's what they leave behind in people. And standing here today, I see that he left behind more than I ever imagined." The crowd seemed to breathe as one, their collective guilt giving way to a deeper understanding of the man they had come to mourn. Tears fell freely now, not just for Robert's passing, but for the profound realization of his unseen sacrifices. But as the crowd began to grasp the full weight of Robert's life, Hattie prepared to share one final story, a moment that would leave them forever changed. Hattie took a moment to steady herself, her hands clasped tightly together as she gazed out at the crowd. The air was heavy, not with sorrow alone, but with a newfound respect for the man they thought they had known. Yet, there was one more story she needed to share, a final act of Robert's life that would define his legacy. 2 months before Robert passed, she began, her voice softer now. "He called me. He wasn't well, but his spirit hadn't faltered. He told me he was putting together a trust, not for himself or his estate, but for the children in this community. Children whose parents struggle to make ends meet. Children who deserve opportunities but are often overlooked." The crowd stirred again, their expressions a mix of surprise and awe. "He knew he wouldn't live to see the trust in action," Hattie continued, her voice breaking slightly. "But he didn't care about that. What mattered to him was planting the seed, making sure it would grow long after he was gone." Samuel stepped forward, his deep voice adding to his mother's words. That trust is real, he said firmly. It's already been established, and it's going to provide scholarships, after-school programs, and mentorship for kids in need. My father wanted his life to mean something, not just to the people he knew, but to the generations that would come after him. Hattie looked around, her gaze meeting each mourner's eyes. That was Robert's greatest gift, she said. He didn't need recognition or applause. He just needed to know he had done his part to make the world a little better. A long silence followed, the weight of her words settling into the hearts of everyone present. Some nodded quietly, others wiped away tears, and a few simply stood still, lost in thought. Hattie placed a hand on the polished headstone, her voice growing softer but no less resolute. So now, I leave you with this. How will you be remembered? Not for the things you had or the titles you earned, but for the lives you touched and the love you gave. She turned back to the crowd, her expression kind but firm. If Robert taught us anything, it's that true legacy isn't written in stone. It's written in the hearts of the people you lift up. The crowd seemed to exhale collectively, the emotional weight giving way to quiet reflection. Hattie gave a final nod to Samuel before stepping back, letting the moment settle. As the mourners began to disperse, many approached Hattie and Samuel, offering words of gratitude and promises to honor Robert's legacy. The cemetery, once a place of somber finality, had become a space of renewed purpose. If this story moved you, let it remind you that kindness and sacrifice often go unseen but never go unnoticed. Remember Robert's lesson. Live a life that leaves a lasting impact on others. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to help us continue sharing stories like this one.